I want to ask you, when you're first having your conversations about this story, are you talking about it being a Captain America movie or a Steve Rogers movie? And are they different things? Do they bring a different sensibility besides of it being an Iron Man or a Tony Stark movie? Is there a difference between a Steve Rogers movie and a Captain America film?
Well, we've never written a Captain America movie. We've only ever written for Steve Rogers and for Tony Stark and for all the other people inside the shells. Because, they get too iconic and stiff. If you're writing for the red, white, and blue man, you're only going to write a patriotic story because that's all he is on the outside. So, but Steve is this 90-pound guy from 1943 who's been frozen in ice and had his friend killed in front of him and is material for much more interesting stories than Captain America is. Captain America himself is a boring enough guy. Steve Rogers is pretty interesting.
And what about politics? I mean, if you look at the first Captain America movie, it clearly is influenced at least by domestic surveillance and Edward Snowden. When you're thinking about the political ideology of this film, are you reacting as much to what the stories are giving you as to what's going on in the world, and how do you make sure that you're integrating the two naturally?
That's a you answer.
The answer?
You're the most politically minded.
Yes. You cannot make a movie about a character named Captain America without politics. These films have a global reach to them outside of the U.S. That title has a specific connotation to it. But I think also because of the genre that we like to work in, i.e. on Winter Soldier as a political thriller, on Civil War as a psychological thriller, we like to have thematic issues that have an immediacy or a relevancy to the audience, and modern issues. And I think that adding a political component to the character is absolutely necessary because part of his struggle is an identity question. Is he Captain America or is he Steve Rogers? Mm-hmm. In the first film, he's fighting a very black and white war. He's fighting against the Nazis. It's very clear that there is good and there is bad. In the second film, which is The Winter Soldier, he's fighting against S.H.I.E.L.D., which has been infiltrated by a bad organization. So he has learned not to trust power structures. Mm-hmm. In this film, he is fighting against society for his own identity. And by the end of the film, he makes a very personal choice. So politics are intrinsic to who he is as a character. I feel it's important to dimensionalize him by examining politics and making sure that the issue that he is dealing with has an immediacy and a relevancy to it.
Because one of the things that you're dealing with in this story is the idea of collateral damage and collateral damage during wartime, and that's a real thing. But you also start by talking about collateral damage within the Marvel Cinematic Universe itself, which is a little bit strange that you're kind of you're kind of shining a light at the very genre in which you're working. Was that something that you settled on very early, that you would actually reference the other movies and say, wait a second, in this movie, this entire country seemed to have fallen down and we didn't deal with what actually happened?
Absolutely. You have to. There's a model to these movies in many ways, right? Whether it's an origin story or just a punch up at the end, and I think Marvel's smart enough to break the model because if you give somebody the same flavor of ice cream over and over again, they're going to get sick of it. And so we had all looked at the third act and noticed a similarity where things fall from the sky and ruin stuff, and so we wanted to address that, and we also wanted to make sure that. And so that's why the third act is the third act. It's not, we would be absolutely hypocrites if we did that again. So there were never going to be, at least in our minds, super soldiers to fight at the end. It was always going to get deeper and smaller and more personal.
And when you're having a political debate and you have the character of Vision, who in theory is pure, why doesn't Vision win the debate? And how do you make sure that Vision isn't the voice of reason, that he doesn't always win every argument? And did you have arguments about whether or not Vision would win? I mean, it seems like a trivial question, but it's not, because you have the math that you have to work with.
I think that's how we spent, I think it was probably like November 2013, just discussing that very question right there.
It's important when you have characters that are very powerful to make sure that there is a flaw. An internal flaw, a psychological flaw to the character. It's very difficult for an audience to empathize with somebody who's too powerful. And it's very difficult as a creative team to tell a story where one character can solve all of the issues. So I think it's frankly, when I was a kid, why I was attracted to Marvel characters, because they were human and flawed, and Tony Stark is an alcoholic, and Peter Parker was a very vulnerable kid who was struggling with this incredible power while he was also dealing with high school and acne and girls, and it was what attracted me to them as characters, and I was less interested in characters who are sort of demigods, because it's hard to tell a story with those characters that is relatable to a modern audience.
Does that mean that you really find yourself most comfortable when your characters are out of their costumes, when they're wearing street clothes?
Without question.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I never lose track of the characters in the costumes. It's just another problem that they have during their day, is that, now I have to put on this Iron Man suit and go fly around. It's still Tony Stark suffering in there.
But Vision is intrinsically more interesting when he's cooking
Yeah.
apricot than when he's flying
Well, I mean,
around,
that's why...
laser beaming.
Exactly. I mean, those are the two physically most powerful characters in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
They're essentially magic. They have unlimited power. And the fact that, they fell in love in the comics, which is a little bit of the inspiration for it, but it limits them in a way where if they were just wholly on their side with no sympathies to the other side, they would wipe them out.
Mm-hmm.
But because they are developing feelings for each other, which certainly confuse Vision because he probably doesn't completely make sense to him, that, creates a flaw. Love is their flaw.
Well, that reminds me, like Paul Bettany one time he described like the way he thinks Vision, what makes Vision tick, and he said that I think Vision is just trying to understand humanity. That's sort of Vision's purpose. So I think that even though Vision is can sort of logic out any scenario he wants, I think he knows that people don't always move on logic, and I think he's sort of fascinated with that, and that's part of his exploration.
Do you realize in the development of this story that you don't really have an exterior villain, that the normal way in which a protagonist and an antagonist are created is different in this story, and is that both its attraction and its problem to solve?
Well, we certainly spent probably a solid month trying to figure out a story that did not have Zemo in it. We could not figure out a way to have the third act we wanted in the way that we wanted to do it. I mean, if Tony was merely the antagonist for Steve and Steve was merely the antagonist for Tony, it just wouldn't get to I want to kill the Winter Soldier in the third act. It might start that way, but that's a bummer of a movie. And it's probably not fair to Tony's character.
Well, it's also a weird modulation act that you have to do. It can't be a villain so nefarious that it undermines the two acts of Civil War you've been watching. If a guy steps out from behind the curtain and says, I'm actually worse than the fight you've been having, and it's like, and then they shake hands and go, what were we fighting about? We have to fight him. It makes you feel ripped off. And we wanted this conflict to go all the way through the end of the movie and linger, because there is no right answer to the fight they're having. So we didn't want the villain to show up and provide the correct answer to the fight, which is beat that guy up.
It sounds like you're making a movie that is in many ways in reaction to what has gone wrong on occasion with the genre, which is exactly what you're describing.
Well, or what's ubiquitous with the genre,
Exactly.
and what people might be getting tired of.
Right.
Which is a very traditional structure, which is in the first act, you introduce a hero and a villain. In the second act, they come into conflict. In the third act, the hero beats the villain. This is a movie where arguably you could say that the villain wins the film. He has the most sort of salient argument at the end of the movie. He's probably the most empathetic character outside of T'Challa in the third act. And by the time you get to the end of the film, both what Steve and Tony are doing seems somewhat petty. And that's the point of the movie. The point of the movie is to deconstruct this genre and to give the audience something that they weren't expecting.
That's one thing, Joe and I have always we've always worked in trying to subvert genre. I think in a lot of our work we like that, and we like the idea that you can, there are genre conventions that we're all conditioned to as an audience, and that there's ways that you can manipulate and play those and sort of like work against those at certain moments to create sort of narrative surprise and excitement. I mean, this is like, when's the last superhero movie you saw where the lead superhero of the movie never actually physically confronts the villain? At the end of the movie, neither the second lead, Iron Man, never confronts the villain. T'Challa, Black Panther is the only one who actually even confronts the villain, and all he does is keep the villain from killing himself. You know what I'm saying? It's very, very unconventional for.
It's a tough one to pitch.
Yeah,
It is.
Superhero movie. Yeah.
How important was it to you as well to have 3 black superheroes, to have Black Panther, War Machine, and Falcon in one film?
Unbelievably important. I think that it is incumbent upon us as creatives. I think it's incumbent upon Hollywood, and it's a little sad that Hollywood is behind the curve a little bit. I think that as an industry, it's so visible, and you would assume that it would be progressive. But I think it is our job, making mass entertainment, to keep reflecting what that means. Reflect the diversity of the audience, and so it is absolutely incumbent upon us to keep diversifying.
Christopher, Markus, Stephen McFeely, Anthony and Joe Russo, thank you guys for bringing us your movie. Thank you guys for sticking around.
Thank you all for coming.
Thanks for watching.
Thank you for doing this, Joe.